on racial discrimination in law, in the criminal justice system. And Joe is to start the presentation with a document that was produced back in the 70s regarding the racism or racial disparities in the local criminal justice system. And I am going to be looking into or presenting some information regarding stereotypes and how that has impacted criminal justice in the local community. And Travis will give you his quick background and how to pronounce his tribe's name.
Hi, everyone. My name is Travis Penn. I'm grateful to be with you all today. I've lived in Flagstaff for 8 years. I'm a student and I work at the Southwest Health Equity Research Collaborative at NAU. I spent my early years on the Port Madison Indian Reservation in Washington State, and I also grew up around Portland, Oregon.
I'm on when I'm ready.
Okay, great. Okay, welcome, Joe. I'm a person of Mi'kmaq descent, though I did not grow up in Nova Scotia. My paternal grandfather grew up in Boston. His family came from the Mi'kmaq Yarmouth Reserve community in Nova Scotia. And to give you a little personal background, you know, with my grandpa, because he did drink alcohol, he was often stereotyped as a crazy Indian. And in the military, my grandpa shared how his alcohol use was sometimes used unfairly as an excuse to punish him or demote him. And so today I want to talk about how Indigenous people who use alcohol are responded to by the criminal justice system here in Flagstaff. And Rose, I am still trying to pull up the PowerPoint, and it's this little purple circle. It doesn't seem to show up easily. Maybe I could send it to someone. It's still trying to pull up the PowerPoint.
Okay, I think we might be able, why don't you go ahead and see if you can send it to me, and I'll see if I can be able to get it on for you.
I'll try that.
And then I'm not sure if Joe, you can get back on the camera, or are you just?
I'm trying to. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Right, thank you.
Let's see. I'm trying to. Just a second. I'm using my granddaughter's laptop, and when I click on the camera, oh, can you turn on the camera? Nothing happened. Oh, I see. Okay. Can you see me now? Yeah.
Joe, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Joe Washington. I'm Choctaw and Shawnee, originally from Oklahoma.
And I think we're getting ready because I don't, you didn't have slides on the PowerPoint presentation, Joe. So if you wanted to get started with your part, then Travis can continue to work on getting the PowerPoint up and running.
Okay, yeah. Are we just recording this, or is this live?
We are live, and we have, it looks like 54 people in the meeting.
Okay.
And it's also being recorded.
Okay. All right. I'm going to read from a report, which is the Arizona Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. I'm going to read it roughly, and it is concerning a city in the state of Arizona. The first incident happened when John Thompson Sr., a Navajo who lived on the Star Route outside Winslow, was stopped by a police officer for driving on the wrong side of the road. Through an interpreter, Thompson described to the advisory committee what happened during his encounter with the officer. The police checked both my driver's license and my pickup's title. At that time, there was no citation written out, and the officer told me to produce $12. Thompson had only $7. So the officer stated that if you don't produce the $12 within 5 minutes, I'm going to take you to jail. Thompson's wife, who had been with him during this time, found a friend to write a check for the remaining $5, but the officer refused to accept the check. Thompson was arrested for driving on the wrong side of the road and taken to the police station. The police officer also accused Thompson of being under the influence of alcohol. Once at the city jail, Mrs. Thompson finally raised the $12 to get her husband released from jail. Because of his arrest and incarceration on an alleged traffic offense, Thompson went to DNA People's Legal Services Incorporated in Tuba City for assistance. His attorney, Louise Gibson, wrote to the chief of police and said, "The Thompsons are quite upset about this treatment. At no point were they told what violation was committed. Instead of issuing a citation, Mr. Thompson was forced into the patrol car. He was never given an opportunity to see or sign the citation, but was taken into custody." Gibson also was concerned about the allegation that Thompson was driving under the influence of alcohol. She stressed that both Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Thompson were devout Christians, and Thompson has been the minister of a church for 28 years. The most important concern of Attorney Gibson and the Thompsons was the fear that Navajos and other Native Americans receive the same type of a treatment by local authority, and that this will continue unless something is done to prevent it. The chief of police, Elmo Maxwell, responded to Gibson's letter. He wrote that whenever there's a violation of state and federal law, it is the policy of this department to have Indians living on the reservation post bond at the time of the offense. He said this differential treatment of Indians was necessary because it is almost impossible to get a warrant served on the reservation. The police chief also indicated it is the policy of this department that we cannot accept a check for a night bond, referring to the officer's refusal to accept a check for $5. During an examination of this case, the advisory committee noted that the citation issued to Thompson listed the time of arrest at 8:37 a.m. In summarizing his investigation of the incident, the police chief stated, "It is regretful that Mr. Thompson feels he was abused both verbally and physically. However, this was not the intention of the officer. Also, there are always two sides to every story." Later, commission staff met with the police chief to ask him about the Thompson incident. He said that he had heard about Mr. Thompson from deleted DNA, and that if they had a complaint, they should go to court. Thompson and 2 other American Indians did, in fact, file a complaint in federal district court in Phoenix. Later, the city attorney reported that Thompson was tried and he was found not guilty. The city attorney believed that there has been significant changes since that reservation bond requirement was a policy. He admitted that the bond requirement was an erroneous decision. He said, "Having talked with the officer concerning this matter, I can certainly avow that this is not standard practice, either on the part of that individual or on the part of police officers generally." However, in a later statement, the city attorney wrote that though current practices differ from 2 years ago, a valid argument can be made for requirements of bonding when a violator resides beyond the jurisdiction of the city. The report that I'm reading from is the Arizona Advisory Committee report, United States Commission on Civil Rights. And the city in Arizona that it's talking about is the city of Flagstaff. The report is titled, "Justice in Flagstaff, Are These Rights inalienable. Going further into the report, it continues to say, in another case, the report states, Arlene Tuchewina, a Hopi who teaches third grade at Tuba City Elementary School, had an experience similar to Thompson's. Tuchewina was attending college and living in the city. On either July 3rd or 4th, she was driving in town with her cousins when she failed to stop at a stop sign. She did not notice the stop sign because prior to that time, there used to be a yield sign. Just to the right of me, there was a police car, so I pulled right over. The police officer approached the car and asked for my driver's license, and I gave it to him, she stated. It is at this point that the similarities between the two incidents occurred. Tuchewina said, he looked at my driver's license and says, well, you're from the reservation. I said, yes. He says, well, you're going to have to go down to the police station and post bond. And I asked him why. And he says, all reservation Indians need to go down to post bond. She was taken to the police station despite her explanation to the officer that she was a resident of the city and going to summer school at the college. The officer retorted, doesn't show it on your driver's license. She continued protesting at the police station until a second officer intervened on her behalf. Tuchewina related, he recognized that I was a resident and no resident should be brought in to post bond, but rather have a citation written out. Tuchewina was disturbed by the treatment she received, even though her $12 bond was returned. As a result, she arranged to meet with Chief Magistrate William C. Brady. Judge Brady was familiar with both the Tuchewina and Thompson cases and was dismayed by the situations described. He learned about the cases from DNA People's Legal Services. Judge Brady commented on the Thompson case. Louise Gibson told me she had contacted the chief of police, and she was told by him that it was standard procedure and it was set up by city court. I told her, no way. A traffic citation may be signed, acknowledged by the person getting it, unless there are extraordinary circumstances. Judge Brady accompanied Tuchewina for a meeting with the police chief. She told Chief Maxwell about the incident, and Maxwell said he was going to have a talk with the officer. The judge informed the chief that the bonding procedure was erroneous. According to Judge Brady, Chief Maxwell said, well, we always do it to Indians. And I said, well, you're wrong. The procedure should be stopped immediately. And as far as I know, it was. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Philip Begay, a Navajo residing on the reservation, contended that the police forced him to submit a cash bond of $27.50 for a minor traffic offense. The police alleged that Begay was released on his own recognizance. I personally know a little bit about the Begay case because I came to Flagstaff in 1976 as the executive director of Native Americans for Community Action. And I have been told that the Begay case actually did go to federal district court, and it resulted in a, am I still online?
Yes.
Okay. I know that I was told that there was a consent decision made by the federal district court, a consent judgment, which means that the city of Flagstaff basically admitted the offense and agreed not to do it anymore. And that was the penalty. So those kinds of things kept on going for a while. The report to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission also had an addendum that had to do with the City of Flagstaff powwow of 1976. At that time, and for many years before that, the City of Flagstaff would host a powwow, a Native American event with parades and dances and so on like that. Unfortunately, at all of these events, there was wholesale arrests of Native Americans at the Flagstaff powwow, and most of the people arrested for alcohol violations were Native American. The the Northern Arizona chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union did an investigation of this and had observers throughout town. They observed Flagstaff City Court, and they made a report that was a part of this report to the United States Civil Rights Commission. And this is one of the things that they say. The ACLU feels that improvements need to be made in the following areas. The enforcement of a law prohibiting public drinking from an open container is clearly discriminatory. An overwhelming majority of those who were arrested and jailed for this offense were Indians. No attempt was made to enforce the law against Anglos, who, for example, violated the statute at the parade openly and in full view of police officers. This selective enforcement of the law, resulting in the incarceration of numerous Native Americans, is intolerable. It is a serious blot on a relatively clean powwow record. They also noted that both of the city court judges at the time seemed to impose one-day retroactive sentences as a means of justifying arrests that had been made. Their prevailing attitude seems to be that one-day retroactive is not a significant penalty. These are two examples regarding how the city of Flagstaff was discriminating against Native Americans in traffic violations, sending Indians to jail and requiring them to spend time in jail until they posted a bond. It also shows that there was discriminatory treatment of Native Americans in terms of enforcement of Flagstaff's open container law, where only Indians were arrested for the violations, while non-Indians were allowed to freely drink from open containers during the events at the Flagstaff powwow. Luckily, these events were a long time ago in 1976. The next speaker will talk about more of a history of what has been happening with these types of situations historically and further on after that. My purpose in talking about this was to point out that the city of Flagstaff was the subject of a report to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. So it was a very notorious kind of publicity regarding the city of Flagstaff, and that there were certain things that were documented at this time, although it was around 1975 and 1976. And the next speaker will talk more about the trend.
Thank you, Joe. That was very, very informational, and it ties right into what I am going to say as well. So I'm going to look at this from a slightly different perspective, and basically what I'm going to go over is that while the names of the targets of policing have changed over time, the target of policing has not. So looking historically, basically I used Arizona Daily Sun archives to look for first to look for the term, derogatory term, drunk Indian. And that term was used, of course, in the early part of the 20th century, as well as up until really into the 1970s. And this is part of the drunken Indian stereotype. The drunken Indian stereotype is also known as the firewater myth. And that is a myth that Indians are somehow racially, and I use these terms Indians in quotes at this time, but Indians were racially or genetically unable to, quote unquote, hold their liquor, that this is somehow something that is a racial factor. There is absolutely zero scientific data to support that myth. In fact, all of the data shows that Native American alcoholism amongst Native Americans and alcoholism amongst whites, Caucasians, is pretty close to the same, maybe with one percentage plus or minus. In addition, there are plenty of Native Americans who are perfectly able to drink alcohol in a social setting, just as white people are able to do. But this myth of greater alcoholism among Native Americans was part of the reason why there were state laws and laws around the United States. In Arizona specifically, up until the 1950s, had a state law that made it illegal to sell alcohol to quote unquote Indians. And that law changed in the 1950s. In January 27th of 1953, and I just picked out a selection of articles from the Daily Sun and letters from the Daily Sun that discuss this. In January 27th, 1953, there was a Arizona Daily Sun letter to the editor from a South Side resident, and his letter stated, it was in response to a previous letter by another lady, and his letter stated, in part, the city police seem to be so busy picking up drunk Indians that they just have to be in too much of a hurry. It's funny how a drunk Indian can be seen for blocks away, yet the whiskey peddlers aren't seen by the force at all. And this was in reference to the fact that it was the persons who were drinking alcohol who were being arrested, the Native Americans who were drinking the alcohol who were being arrested, as opposed to the people who were actually violating the law by selling the alcohol to them. On May 7th, 1980, and actually the day before that, there was an article regarding an allegation by a Navajo tribal police officer against Flagstaff Police Department, who accused the Flagstaff Police Department officers of waiting outside local bars that were frequented by Indians in order to arrest them. And the day following, Chief Latham, who was the police chief at the time, submitted a rebuttal. And the headline of that was "Drunk Indian Stereotype Denied by Latham." And in that, his denial and in his rebuttal, Chief Latham said that Indians are dealt with like all other citizens. But he went on to say, where there are more problems, there are more police, and the front street bars are where we have more problems. He said that last year, meaning 1979, that there had been 7,190 drunks taken to the CPAR, which was Flagstaff Detox Center. Of that number, 95% were Native Americans. And he also said, but they were sent there with no charges and no citations. He said that took up 2,500 to 3,000 man hours of quote unquote public service to Navajos. A lot of hours go to taking care of drunks. He also said if there were specific charges, they'd be happy to investigate them. As it is, the Navajo police officers' charges are without merit and without any substantiation. It's ridiculous. They're picked up for their own safety. We don't stake out bars to haul in DWIs. So that was in 1980, and that is essentially the same statements that are being made now. I came here I came to Flagstaff in 1986 as a young lawyer, and I worked for a local law firm. We did a lot of public defense work. And I had one of my very first clients that I had as a lawyer was a young Native American man. And I really didn't know exactly how to initiate a client interview with him. So I was stumbling around trying to look at the police report and speak with him. And I asked him, I said, so it looks like you've been arrested for DWI. And what he said to me was, and I said, oh, do you know what that means? And what he said to me without a pause was, yeah, driving while Indian. And that was my that was my introduction to Flagstaff. And I know that the Native Americans who are listening in on this presentation probably are pretty familiar with that term at the time. Those that aren't, of course, DWI meant at the time drinking while intoxicated. But because stereotypical policing was known to exist, this young man told me that that meant driving while Indian here in Flagstaff. This stereotype pervades law enforcement stops. And it's not just Flagstaff, it's a lot of other border towns as well. But Flagstaff is certainly in that group. Now, the interesting thing is that looking at the Daily Sun and looking at the historical archives, you can see that there has been a trend. There's been a change in the use of terminology. Drunk Indians is no longer used, and it stopped being used somewhere in the 70s, maybe the 80s. However, at that point, the police department started using the term street drunks or street alcoholics. And that's because obviously the term drunk Indians is overtly racist. Street drunks or street alcoholics at least has the sound as though it's not racist. But nonetheless, even if the name was changed, the focus of investigation and targeting was still on Native Americans. The terminology was again changed in and around the mid-2000s to around 2008. Again, looking through the archives, the term street drunk and street alcoholic stopped being used around 2008. So the next term that was used, and the term that is currently in use, is called public intoxicants. And you can look at the archives of the Arizona Daily Sun and the current articles, and you'll see that term is used a lot. Now, interestingly, it's not a crime to be intoxicated in public, but nonetheless, the term that's used for contacts is public intoxicants. In 2018, Flagstaff Police Department reported in their annual report that they had made 3,440 public intoxicant contacts. And in 2019, they reported that they had made 3,058 public intoxicant contacts. There's no racial distinctions made, or none of the reports indicate how many of those people that were contacted who were publicly intoxicated, how many of them were Native American. We can only surmise that. However, we can surmise it as based on certain other numbers. And this is where the disparity of treatment of Native Americans that was occurring when the Civil Rights Report came out still happens. Flagstaff's Native American population is around, slightly less than, but around 10% of the total Flagstaff population. Coconino County's population is about 28% Native American. But the Flagstaff Police Department reports that from 2015 to 2019, 51% of all arrests in the city were of Native American peoples. They also report that of 398 arrests in 2019 for public consumption, as in an open container, 87% of those arrests were of Native Americans. And we can go further on that. We can look at the disparities with regard to bookings. And as Joe mentioned in the report in the 70s, in that report, it was noted that Native Americans were more likely to be booked into the county jail rather than issued a citation and a summons to appear voluntarily at a court hearing. And that still occurs. And you can see that with respect to DUI arrests, for example. DUI arrests, which is the term now used, it used to be driving while intoxicated. Now it's driving under the influence. So it's a DUI arrest. Of DUI arrests, Native Americans only made up about 42% of the arrests in 2019, while whites made up 56% of those arrests. And this is according to the Flagstaff Police Department's annual report. However, when you look at booking records, you find that if into the county jail, you find that of the arrests most likely to be cited and released, those arrests are actually mostly DWI arrests. However, arrests for disorderly conduct, which are not DWI arrests and which are much more likely to be Native Americans, those arrests result almost entirely in bookings, as do arrests for for open containers. So you can see that even now and throughout the years, the disparity in policing behavior has not changed, even though the terminology has. And these stereotypes persist. The drunk Indian stereotype and the criminal justice response has simply not changed. Native Americans are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement for their alcohol use. And what happens is that this disproportionate intervention reinforces the stereotypes that lead to a revolving door of policing and suspicion that all Native Americans are alcoholics. And that again, in turn, leads to police looking at Native Americans suspiciously as though they're all Native Americans. And this only hurts our community and the Native Americans that are living within it. And Travis, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. And I know you have additional information on current numbers.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I have switched accounts here. Can people see my screen?
Just you.
So it's just me, huh? You don't see the PowerPoint?
No.
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't think I was able to figure this out in time. I was trying different methods to pull up the PowerPoint. I had some charts and figures to show folks, but I'll just kind of discuss what I was going to discuss without the images to go along with them. So let's see. So first I wanted to share a quote from a book, which is, the title of the book is Colonialism is Crime. And the authors in this quote are referencing criminologist Steven Spritzer, who defines social junk as people that are considered bad for our society and who must be contained. An example would be people who use alcohol in public. So, and the criminologist Steven Spritzer defines social dynamite as people who pose an actual or potential political challenge to dominant society, and they must be contained and directly attacked and targeted. So an example of social dynamite would be something like protesters. So the authors of Colonialism is Crime, they use these definitions of social junk and social dynamite, and they explain how an indigenous person who uses alcohol, how they operate within dominant society. So they write, Even those who have succumbed to the horrors of the past and present and self-medicate with alcohol and drugs refuse to quietly disappear. They remain where they are seen, are troublesome, and must be controlled by the criminal justice system. Even as social junk, they function as social dynamite. They are a reminder of the colonial crimes committed against them. And so I feel this quote, it helps explain the efforts, the concerted efforts by the Flagstaff Police Department, the city and the county courts and the county jail system to criminalize alcohol use among Indigenous people. It looks like Rose is trying to pull it up again. Hey, there it is. It happened. So I wonder if I can move this along. Oh, it disappeared again. That was just on my end. Did you guys see that?
It disappeared on my side too.
That's unfortunate. Gave me some hope.
I know. Sorry.
Okay, I'll just keep going. If you do pull it up, I'll have you skip forward. But so anyway, what my fellow presenters have shown is that there is an issue and a history of over-criminalizing this behavior. So in the Flagstaff, there are Indigenous people who drink in public, and they are reminders of the colonial crimes committed against the Ne, Hopi, and other peoples. They are reminders of the tolls that these crimes have taken. The Flagstaff Police Department chooses to see them as social junk and even social dynamite, to see them as threats, as outsiders, rather than people holding up a mirror to Flagstaff, people who have experienced harms in their own land. So to summarize what Wendy and Joe were referring to, they have shown that this issue has been pointed out dating back to the 70s. They have shown that while the stereotyping language of Indigenous people who use alcohol in public has become more politically correct, the underlying biases have remained. So in my section, I want to discuss police, courts, and jails' current responses to this issue. So first, the police arrests, like Wendy had mentioned, Indigenous people are arrested at a far greater rate than other populations in Flagstaff. They are incarcerated or arrested at disproportionately high rates for low-level alcohol offenses. So one explanation is that Indigenous people are committing more of these crimes, which is an explanation that is implied in the police's lack of acknowledgement of that these arrest disparities is even an issue that they need to address further. Another explanation is that Indigenous people and the behaviors they engage in are unfairly targeted for arrest. Part of this may have to do with FPD's policy manual, which includes a mission to protect the quality of life of Flagstaff. So I and others have argued that emphasizing the criminalization of behaviors that threatens this quality of life of Flagstaff residents, by doing this, the police have left open the door for racial bias and this type of broken windows policing. So we have to ask whose quality of life is being protected by this policy focus. So the types of arrests regularly made imply that it is white middle-class sensibilities which are being protected from offense. It is their quality of life that is being protected. For instance, whether police are answering calls about or choosing to target Indigenous people using alcohol, the police are essentially policing behaviors that do not pose a grave threat to anyone. Rather, Indigenous people are profiled. Their behaviors are targeted because they are perceived as acting in an offensive way, behaviors that disturb the quality of life of white middle-class types of residents. Sometimes, in their readiness to weed out such individuals in the community, the absence of an open container may not stop an officer from pulling someone over. They may come up with another reason like they look suspicious, and they run someone's driver's license, and they may find a warrant or use the crime of trespassing or some other offense to justify an arrest once they've pulled someone over. So what the police may not realize is that this looking suspicious is often warranted, since Indigenous people are often pulled over for little or no reason. They're often harassed by police for little or no reason. So the police department officers have been asked, based on the history that my friends provided, and based on this quality of life policing model, they have been asked to be vigilant around these low-income, unsheltered Indigenous people walking along the streets of Flagstaff. They have been trained and they have been asked to see these folks as potential threats that must be targeted for control. So there is a case to argue that people who drink excessively and walk around can be a danger to themselves, but that doesn't mean that arrest or the hospital stays should be always in order. But this is what happens here. They're either, when they're pulled over, they're usually either sent to jail or they're sent to the hospital. But where is the third option? Why does the police department rely so heavily on arrest to address this issue of public drinking in public? So I had a chart here, and what it showed is that it's safe to assume that Indigenous people in Coconino County are drinking in so-called criminal ways about as much as Indigenous people in nearby counties. Yet the number of liquor law violations per 1,000 people is more than double here in Coconino County versus the next highest violation county, which is Navajo County. So they have this, this shows that this behavior of public drinking is far, far more criminalized here in Coconino County than it is in other nearby counties. So as far as courts are concerned, data from the Coconino jail reveals a startling double standard when it comes to the way that alcohol-related misdemeanors are charged and the way they are sentenced to jail. So if there are the odds of being sentenced to a crime and serving jail for an alcohol-related misdemeanor if you're Indigenous is 11-1 when compared to a white person. So that means that when you go, if you're charged with the same crime, some alcohol-related misdemeanor like drinking in public, and you go before a court and you're Indigenous, you have 11-1 odds of being convicted of that crime and then serving a jail sentence for that crime. So it's a huge disparity, and it's not all to be put on blame on the court, but of course it does raise questions. It shows that these behaviors are far more criminalized among Indigenous people, and those convictions happen a lot more often. So the final thing I want to discuss is the jail here in Coconino in Flagstaff. So the jail population growth is outpacing most other states here in Arizona. Most of these jails are, more and more of these jails are being filled with Indigenous people. In Arizona, they have some of the highest increases of Indigenous incarceration rates in jail than any other state in the country. So here in the local jail, Indigenous people are vastly overrepresented specifically for alcohol-related charges. While Indigenous people make up less than 9% of the population in Flagstaff, they're 40% of those that are incarcerated in the jail for alcohol. Compare that to the white population, which makes up about 80% of the Flagstaff, but less than 50% of those incarcerated for an alcohol-related charge. And then once they're in the jail, Indigenous people are not afforded appropriate services to address alcohol use disorders. Even if we accept the premise that alcohol use in public is a criminal threat to public safety, there is a need for services that speak to the issues behind this behavior. As the quote I read in the beginning of my section explains, Indigenous people have faced colonialism and it has led to the use of alcohol to self-medicate. Yet in the Coconino jail, there is no full-time Native counselor who can understand their specific pains, their specific traumas. The sweat lodge ceremony there at the jail happens very, very rarely. and it really only caters to men inside the jail. The services for incarcerated individuals to curb drinking habits through the program of Exodus is not reaching all those who need help, and it does not account for the impacts of colonialism and the specific issues that come with that. So the jail, in many cases, through the high costs and hurdles of incarceration, through unequal treatment inside, becomes an extension of colonialism. It becomes another way that disadvantages are deepened in our community. It's another reason to self-medicate and to find yourself in cycles of self-harm. So I just want to end by saying that this is an urgent issue. I hope that the history that Wendy and Joe have shared shows you that this is not a new issue, but it's a continuation of an issue. And as Indigenous people are cycled through the criminal justice system in Flagstaff, they're not encouraged to find reasons to change alcohol use behaviors. They find themselves criminalized for simply being an offense to white society, for self-medicating in response to generations of colonialism in this town and in this region. So the City Council, the County Board of Supervisors, and those who select and elect the local police chiefs, sheriffs, and judges, they need to take action to change this dynamic in Flagstaff, to offer that third option. Thank you for providing me this opportunity to speak with you all today. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Travis, and thank you, Wendy and Joe. I really appreciate the information that you've brought forward. And I know that as our council members have said, and also some of our leadership here at City, there's going to be some hard conversations and maybe some things that we will need to do as a community. And those are the things that I know that right now, I think we're at a really important and pivotal time that we can bring these forward. And I'm really happy just the fact that the people that I work with here at City, the ones that I have interacted with, have been very supportive in listening to these topics and to these hard conversations that need to happen. And I'm really so grateful for the members of Indigenous Circle of Flagstaff to have reached out to all community members to talk about some of these things and to bring attention and to bring light to it, so that we begin rebuild our relationships and rebuild our kinship in this community. And I know that some areas are stronger than others. And I know that some of our county leadership is also on the line here. And I just want to thank them for their time, because they are very crucial parts to being the voice for our people. And I challenge the people in this presentation to elevate these issues in the way that is, in other words, use the privilege that you have to elevate the things that are in some of our Indigenous people that are most vulnerable are having to deal with. And really, they have nowhere to turn. They have no one to turn to a lot of times. And we are it. We're the ones who are in the business of service. We are in the business of making sure our community is healthier. And I think these are times when we need to just gather ourselves and say, okay, what can we do to make this better? What can we do to make sure all community members are looked after and are listened to? So I really, really appreciate the time that everybody has put in, from the community members to county leadership, to Flagstaff leadership, and also our young professionals like Travis and Darian and the other panels that were on earlier that are very concerned and are very caring for these topics. Thank you so much. I know that probably if there are some things that you want to ask, we're very basically out of time, but you are welcome to reach out to Wendy, to Travis, and to Joe to talk about some of these things that they have real knowledge about. So I appreciate that, and I really thank you for your time again.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you for everyone who's here representing the city and the county. And I agree that with Rose that there's a lot of responsibility on their shoulders, but it's also on all of our shoulders in the community. And we want to support you because I know a lot of you do care about this issue and are doing what you can to address it. So thank you so much.
All right, we'll see you in the next session. Thank you.